Hello, very good evening. Welcome to today's webinar on stakeholder communication. This webinar will be delivered by Ian Moody. And before we start off, I'd just like to take you through a few administrative details, a few housekeeping details. After the webinar, the slides will be available on our SlideShare page, and we will email the link to you. Also, the recording of this webinar will be available for you to download. We will email that link to you as well. After the webinar, there will be a post-webinar survey that will pop up. Please do take the time to complete this for us. As you go along the webinar, if you have any questions that might come in your mind, you can type them out onto the chat box on your screen on the right-hand side, and we will allocate time for Ian to address your questions at the end. Moving on, let me just very quickly introduce you to Ian Moody. Well, Ian Moody has more than 25 years of experience in senior management positions. He runs several of our supply chain and procurement related courses. He's very, very closely associated with SIPS. He's a lead tutor. Also, he is here on courses and conferences very, very often in Dubai. So if you ever have to attend a course with him, please do contact us. Passing it over to Ian now. I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Okay, thank you, Mega. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Right, I can see we've got some people online. Okay, right, I think we're ready to go. We're going to talk about stakeholders this afternoon. And I think the best thing to do with all of these things is before we get into any detail, is just make sure we all have an agreed or generally understood definition. If you look up the word stakeholders, you'll find hundreds of different definitions of stakeholder. One of the best widely accepted ones is in a book called Exploring Strategy by Jerry Johnson, Kevin Scholes, and Richard Whittington. It says a stakeholder are those individuals or groups who depend on an organization to fulfill their goals, and on whom in turn the organization depends upon. It simply means anybody's a stakeholder. When you actually look at that, that's exactly what it means. Anybody could be a stakeholder. And in there is one of the biggest complications. Understanding stakeholders and learning and having the ability to be able to communicate with them is extremely complex. Now, obviously, in a short period of time, we can't cover every possible methodology and all the rest of it, but we can certainly get everybody thinking about the problem. I often say to my students within the university, and I think you may have just picked up, I work in London University as well as here, really, understanding stakeholders is understanding business. Stakeholders are king, they're everything. You need to be able to work with your stakeholders. It's very complex. It can get very, very difficult. One of the biggest problems I find with people when they start to analyze stakeholders on a very practical basis is they will do it during an environmental analysis phase when they're having an overview of their business and their corporate strategy and how they're relating that, and they won't do it again. Well, the problem is stakeholders keep moving position. They come, they go, they change the level of interest and power in the organization. It doesn't stay still. Nothing stays still. So why are stakeholders really important? Why do we talk about them so much? Is because they try to influence organizations to do things in the way they want them to be done. There is an enormous amount of public and regulatory pressure on business organizations to act socially responsibly, to meet the requirements that are laid down for it. And this is on a global basis, it's on a national basis, it's all over the place. There's so much of this going on. So what is happening, if we look at the reality of it, is organizations are being basically bullied, pushed into doing certain things by the public, by the media. Media is one of the strongest stakeholder groups of all. They have so much influence on businesses and how businesses perform. and organizations themselves. I mean, everybody these days is talking about ethics and CSR frameworks and how they're going to operate sustainability programs, all this kind of very, very important aspect of business thinking today, which is linked to a concept known as triple bottom line reporting, where we go beyond purely the profit motives and profit methodologies of reporting. So we're getting involved in so many different aspects, and stakeholders are everything and everywhere, so they're impacting on these things. Okay, if you try to categorize stakeholders, if you try to group them, there are in fact three groups, generally accepted, and it's nice and easy if you do it this way. Internal stakeholder groups, connected stakeholder groups, external stakeholder groups. Some people have started calling external stakeholders secondary. I still like internal, connected, external because it spells ice. So it's extremely easy to remember. We all like ice in a drink or something. So, you know, it's useful to remember ice. Anyway, internal stakeholders, connected stakeholders, external. Internal stakeholders are usually explained or defined as a group of individuals who have a contract with the organization and have day-to-day contact. So in simple terms, what does that mean? That means the employees of the company, they have day-to-day contact, they work within the organization. And of course, they have an employment contract, so they're an internal stakeholder. We can also think about management. Now, in terms of strategic thinking, when we start using the term management, we're actually talking about director levels here. We're not talking about, you know, departmental managers. We're talking about directors and those that are associated in law as a director, because they have legal obligations to the members. That is to say that they have certain obligations in law that have to be maintained on behalf of the shareholders. They also, depending on where you are in the world, have considerable additional obligations under things like the Companies Act, for example, in the UK. And if a director of a company breaches the Companies Act, depending on the offence, he can find himself in prison for up to 25 years. It's that serious. So they have different obligations, but they're internal stakeholders, and that's why we tend to say staff managers. And of course, then what happens is people group themselves into functions and departments. So, you know, you can say that we have an internal function, which is a stakeholder and has got a stakeholder relationship to another internal function, because the definition quite clearly said individuals or groups of individuals, internal stakeholders. So a contract and day-to-day contact. Connected stakeholders are in fact external. They don't work with inside the organization, but they do have a contract. They're connected by means of a contract. So for example, a shareholder. A shareholder in an organization has a contractual a relationship with that organization, but with thinking of them as shareholders, they don't work inside the organization. Customers, the people who buy from the organization, the clients, the customers, to the correct meaning of the word, end user, the consumer. These are the people who buy from the organizations, and when they do, they have a contractual obligation between them. The suppliers, exactly the same. There's a contractual obligation with a supplier. They don't work inside the organization, but there is definitely a contractual relationship with a supplier. You could say this might include things like governmental departments where tax needs to be paid because there's a contractual obligation to pay tax. It would certainly include lenders, major lenders, people that lend money on a long-term basis to the organization. They have got the contractual obligations. But it's also short-term lenders. You know, if the company needs a bank overdraft or something, there is a contractual obligation to repay that overdraft with the bank. So they're all connected stakeholder groups. We've then got these truly external ones that have no contract at all. There is no contractual relationship whatsoever, and they don't work inside the organization. But nevertheless, they can be extremely powerful. If we take simple groups of these, we can talk about the public. If the public do not like what an organization is doing, they can influence the organization in such a way that the organization has to change its methodologies, its business practices, etc. The press, the media, um, everybody knows how powerful they are. Now, the problem is local media in some parts of the world will have levels of restriction upon them, but companies work within global environments. And whatever we say about it, global media are not restricted and will say what they wish to say, and they can seriously damage businesses. Um, Beyond that, potential suppliers, potential customers, there's no contract yet, but they're thinking about buying from you, they're thinking about selling to you, they're interested in what you're doing because they're going to look at their reputation, they're going to look at the risk to themselves before they start coming into business with you. Unions might be another example. Government departments generally have interest in the way organizations are being run. They're concerned about what's happening in organizations. So three groups of stakeholders, and we start to see the complexity. It gets even worse when you suddenly realize that it's possible for an individual or group of individuals to be categorized under all three of these groupings. So for example, if you're a member of the public because you live in Dubai, you remember the public, you have interest in Dubai. So you have interest in the success and future of Dubai, and therefore you have interest in future and success of the businesses in Dubai, but it's simply as a member public. But you may also be a customer of that organization. So there's a contractual arrangement as a customer of that organization. Quite simply, that could happen. I don't know. Any example you like. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you buy airline tickets from Emirates. So you're a customer of Emirates. So you have interest in Emirates. Um, but you may also work for them as well at the same time. So you could be categorized in all three. So it becomes very complex because it's a question of hats. And people find it very hard to separate their levels of responsibility or the levels of interest or the levels of power and influence over different levels. So it can become extremely difficult to know how to satisfy different stakeholder groups. Okay, so few quick, just back up here, what I just said, there we are, examples of internal stakeholders, directors, managers, as I explained, staff, team members, technical functions, design functions, manufacturing functions, sales and marketing, all these different functions. So individuals and of course the groups. So there's your internals. Your connected stakeholders, examples, only examples, shareholders, end customers, intermediates, agents, distributors, retailers, suppliers, financial institutions, lenders, banks, all as I said. Okay, all these different groupings. And then, of course, external. But as I say, we've got to be careful because it's quite possible for everyone or in a group of individuals to find themselves in all of these different categories. Stakeholder management. Uh, Stakeholder management is about the interest and likely response that a given stakeholder has or you look at. When you consider a stakeholder, what level of interest have they got? Do you understand their interest in your business? And how might they respond if you do something they don't like? Or if you do something they do like? Do you understand how to communicate effectively with them? How to work with them on all the matters that understand that impact on them or affect them? But again, of course, it's going to be complicated if they're in all the different groupings. But do you know? Now, one of the biggest problems about communication is it's an illusion. George Bernard Shaw is famous for saying the problem with communication is it's an illusion, it's been achieved. If you don't know who George Bernard Shaw was, he was a very famous Irish playwright of his generation. But communication is an illusion that it's been achieved. We assume that communication has happened. We assume people have understood. We've assumed that people see it our way, but that's not necessarily the case. When you think about communication, you think about it in detail. Really, what are we trying to do when we communicate? We're trying to get someone to change their behavior. We're trying to communicate with someone because we don't want them to do it like that. We want them to do it the way we want it done. So we're trying to change their behavior from doing it their way to doing it our way. Another area of stakeholder management is engaging people, getting their interest, getting their support, getting their commitment, right? Getting them to work with us rather than against us. Getting their buy-in, I think, is a well-known expression that works quite well. Managing all of the potential issues, all of the problems areas that are going to arise because of resistance operation from different influential groups. But as already indicated, the power and influence of stakeholders moves all over the place. It's not constant. It changes all the time. The reality is, every time we try to do something in a business organization, however big or however small it may be, we are making changes to the status quo. People don't like change. People love progress, but they don't like change. Change is a message that basically says you're doing it wrong. So people will try to resist it. And as they start to resist it, they will create more and more problems during that process. And ultimately, they can start to oppose it. No, this is not a webinar on change management. Could easily be so. And these things are all interconnected, but anyway. So we have a famous tool. We have three famous tools that we use to look at stakeholders and to look at their level of power. Power is simply explained as the ability to influence something, and the level of interest they may have in that organization. The one that always is the most common one used is Mendelow's matrix. And what we do with Mendelow is we go into each one of those groups, and go backwards for a moment, and we list the stakeholders under internal. We list the ones that are relevant under connected and the ones that are relevant under external. So we categorize them. We categorize the stakeholders. Now that effectively gives us a key. Once we've got a key, we can start to look at them and say, what level of power and interest do they actually have? Now, before we go any further, it doesn't matter how you draw this. As long as you do it the right way in the boxes, it doesn't matter whether you put low there and high there, or whether you put low here or high there. My temptation is always to put low here and high there, but to be honest, this slide is the more common one, and I believe it's only so it goes A, B, C, D. That doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. What matters is this. We have a stakeholder that has very little interest in whatever you are doing within your business. And they have very little power in terms of their ability to influence or change what you're trying to do. And therefore, you do not have to do a lot to keep them happy. So you can put minimal effort in. Maybe all you need to do is send out a little newsletter or something, and it could be on the staff notice board or advert in the newspaper. It's just minimal stuff. But as their interest starts to grow and develop, as it gets more concerned to them, which is really what we mean by interest, then you're moving next to the next category. And that's when you really have to start to keep people informed. You have to keep them aware of what you're doing, why you're doing it, when you're doing it, etc., using the principles of the W's: who, where, when, where, and what, who, where, when, what, why. keeping people fully informed. And they need to be kept informed, because the problem is, if they're not kept informed, they can become a destructive force. You do have stakeholders who have very little interest in what you're doing, but very, very high levels of power. So all you've got to do is keep them satisfied, keep them happy. Different ways of doing that. We'll come to those anyway. And then finally, you get this top group, the key players, where their interest is extremely high and their power is extremely high. Now, it depends on what is happening. You could quite easily argue that the newspapers, the media, should sit in category A. But if you do something wrong that they report in the newspapers, all of a sudden they move to category D. For example, recently Volkswagen Group have found themselves in a lot of trouble. They've had some problems with emissions within their engines, and they've misstated, overstated the level of, emissions, so that they're making it sound like their engines are more efficient than they really are. This is actually a supply chain problem. The problem rests within the supply chain. However, they've got it wrong, and they try to hide it. The press got a hold of the story. Only a few days ago, 2-3 days ago, I read in the newspaper that the press are now making Volkswagen appear to be out as the worst car company to ever exist in the world, and are very happy to tell everyone about how dishonest they are, how bad they are, and how they're going to have to pay out $90 billion to fix the problem. $90 billion. You know, it's an enormous amount of money. And the press have fueled that. They've made it worse. So if I was the CEO at Volkswagen, I'd be making sure I take care of the press. I need them on my side, not against me. So they can become key players, quite simply. It depends on who they are. It depends with suppliers, for example. Some suppliers will be key players. Some won't be. It depends on what you're buying, the level of importance, the level of risk of what you're buying. It all depends. A lot of people think that obviously shareholders are key players. Well, not normally, actually. Shareholders only become key players at voting time, which is once a year. The rest of the time, keep them informed, keep them satisfied is quite good enough for shareholders. They don't need any more. It varies. So there's ways of looking at these people. So if we have a categorization of them by going through this idea of the classification of internal, connected, external, if we've classified them in a Mendelow analysis in more detail, then we can start to think of them from a positional point of view. Are they our partners? Are they individuals who support the change? Are they there to support the change agent to do its work, to move forward? Are they our allies? They support, but they need encouragement. They need help to support. So they're not yet partners. They are going to support, but they need to be encouraged. They need to be influenced. Are they fellow travelers? They're coming on the journey with us. They're not actually supporting us, but they're still with us. They're coming along with us. Are they bedfellows? People that like the idea of a change, but don't know if they actually trust the change agent. It's this idea. We should do this. It's a good idea, but I'm not sure we trust. These are known as bedfellows, fence sitters, people who sit on the side of the fence. Don't know which way they're going to go. They're quite dangerous. They are. You never know where they're going. You could often argue that's the press. Excuse me. Loose cannons. People who could literally go with you or against you. Opponents, people who are against you. They are completely and utterly against you. But you know what? They might quite like the agent on a personal basis. So if you're not aware of this idea of change agents are the individuals or groups of individuals who are responsible for managing and implementing a change. Um, okay, opponents, right? Adversaries, they don't like the change agent and they don't like the idea. And then we have the voiceless ones, the silent stakeholders who say very little. They're the passives, and who knows what might happen there because you don't get any information from them. Different stakeholder analysis positioning. So if we're going to start to communicate properly with our stakeholders, if we're going to develop plans that work, there are certain key things. We need to understand the goals of each group, but we need to recognize those goals are ever moving. It's a little bit like the sand. It doesn't stay still. When the wind blows, it can go anywhere. So goals, do we understand their goals? Do we understand our goals? Have we clearly define our goals? And where do we get congruence? The idea that their goals match our goals and our goals match their goals. Can we come together? Can we form a marriage, actually, between them? We need to know. And where are the gaps? Where are the areas? What's the gaps? What are the desired outcomes from these goals we're trying to get to? All right. Do we know how to market our stakeholders? Do we actually understand how to work with them? How to market them? Marketing fundamentally means anticipating business need. One of the definitions of marketing is to anticipate need and to meet it profitably and efficiently into the future. Well-known definition of marketing. So stakeholder marketing, do we really understand what their needs are? And do we have communication programs that satisfy each one of them? Do we understand the principles of relationship management? Do we know how to manage relationships effectively through all of the various stages, from adversarial to collaborative relationships, and through the stages that they move through? Do we understand that? Issues. Do we actually know what the issues are that they have in detail? What are their problems? What don't they like? You know, and do we know how to manage our way through those? So, this is a very short webinar. It's very little time. So we can't go into lots of detail, but certainly these are things to think about in the future. So what is the process then? Well, first of all, you identify the stakeholder groups. You do that by going through internal, connected and external. You then use a mapping system like the Mendelow matrix to assess stakeholder power and influence and assess their level of interest they may have. Then you map that information to develop a set of strategies. So what are the strategies? Oh, hang on, sorry, excuse me. Going the wrong way. The strategies we're trying to develop, well, they're going to be around a goal analysis, the outcomes, etc. Well, what are we going to do? How's our tactics going to work? Develop it. Make sure we've really understood all those goals that people have, and now start to plan how to negotiate for a mutual goal fulfillment. So we're all going in the same direction. It's not difficult as a mapping. It's extremely difficult to do in practice. Okay, the principle of doing this is as follows. Notify. Tell them what you're doing. You're going to do something. Now inform them of the processes that you're going to go through. Now ask them for their opinion through the consultation phase. Now involve them so they feel they're part of the process. Then collaborate with them so that you come together, and finally, wherever possible, let them do it. Give them empowerment. Empowerment is the ultimate level of delegation. So give them empowerment, empower them to actually start to do it for themselves. So here we go. This is what it might look like. If we go through this bit by bit, now this is been stolen, no, sorry, terrible word there, adapted, I should say, right? It comes from a document that's at Birmingham City University, and it's adapted from that. So I have to point that out because I don't want anyone to turn around and say that it's, we're not accrediting it appropriately. Sorry, excuse me, sore throat. What do we do when we notify them? And the level of engagement, the stakeholder may encounter untargeted project publicity. So you could be careful because they may get information sent to them or given to them that actually is not required. So you need to make sure it's targeted properly to them. You have to be aware that other people may also be targeting them, even though you don't want them to. But you must also make sure that the information that is available is made available to them. What are the stakeholder roles? At this stage, the stakeholder is simply a recipient. They're not doing anything. They're just a recipient of the information. But certainly they can start to build up a dialogue, start to work together with project staff to come into a future. Next thing is the engagement tools. What kind of engagement tools work best in this scenario? Untargeted publicity, for example, just general publicity, adverts in newspapers, that kind of thing. Access to minutes or documents where necessary. Use of websites. It's untargeted, it's not specific, but they're beginning to engage because you're just notifying people of things are happening. There's going to be something that's going to happen. And what should happen, what's the anticipated output of that? You should start to get a general awareness. People should start to feel, you know what, we do understand what's happening, we do understand why it's happening. Then you move to the next phase, and the next phase is to inform. So again, what's the level of engagement? Here, stakeholders are regularly and reliably informed of what is happening. They're made aware that they have rights, and then you want them to participate in the change, in the project that's taking place. And that means keeping them informed. All right, moving on. The stakeholder roles. At this point, the stakeholder is passive still. They're still recipients of conceptualized information, but it's a little bit more detailed than it was in the notifying stage. They're starting to build up dialogue, more dialogue, even if they're not being asked to, because they're beginning to get involved. How do you do this? What engagement tools use? Briefings, blogs, targeted letters to people, targeted emails to people, anything that's targeted. Excuse me. And then finally, what should happen because of this? People should start to get informed. They should have a level of conceptualized awareness in what's happening around them. You should be there. Next phase, next stage you go through is you consult. So what happens now? The project staff responsible go out and they get all the views of the stakeholders. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? Is this a good way? Is this a bad way? Etc. Right? And you also give feedback to the stakeholders and tell them why you're making certain decisions, what the reasons are, whatever they happen. So what that means now, obviously, is consult. So now at this point, the stakeholder has become a respondent. They're responding to things. They're not just sitting back. They're not passive anymore. They're actually beginning to get involved, to be responsive. That means that you need to make sure that you get plenty of time laid down for consultation, time in meetings, etc. Always ensure that there's a right to give feedback, to reply, and you always make sure that you understand that what this will mean, the level of dialogue going on between the stakeholder groups and the change agent is going to grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger. The tools, opinion polls is one of them. What do you think of this? How do you think this works? Focus groups. Creating groups, project focus groups within the stakeholders. You go to the different stakeholder groups in your classification and you start to say, okay, who focuses on this, who's going to tell you that, who's going to deal with this part of the project, etc. And of course, the project staff start to produce detailed questionnaires. They go out and they produce interviews and they interview the different stakeholders and see what they think and what they understand, etc. And therefore, this should lead to widespread conceptual awareness and even the emergence of reactionary data. They're coming back now. They're telling you what to do. You can now move to involve, where to become much more involved. You start to work with the stakeholders together. You're going towards the goal. You've taken their views into account. You've taken their opinions into account, and you're going to go to all the goals. So basically what you're after now is input. You want real detailed input now. Okay, so the stakeholder groups are in reality a team member. They are actually a part of the team. Beyond that, they are participating. And this means skills development. How do you do this? You create workshops. You give people votes. You get focus groups. You lead consultation groups. You use open staff directed interviews where you say, okay, there's a series of interviews going on here, and everybody can put their opinion in, etc. By doing this, what you're going to get is stakeholders who accept the agenda and recognize what's happening. Sorry. Right. Collaborate. Finally, coming through to the end of the plan is all aspects of the decisions should now be used and discussed in partnership with the stakeholders. The stakeholders are now molded, they're shaped to your way of thinking. You've made adjustments to take into account their level of interest and power. You are now thinking of stakeholders as collaborators. They're coming together with you on the journey. Okay. So you've got them into action groups, stakeholder groups. How do you engage them? Consultations, open interviews, closed interviews, sometimes open, sometimes closed, depending on what you need to do. I mean, even things like taking people away from the office and say, right, let's go and do this and let's go and talk about things out of the office, etc. These are way day type ideas that people use. Agendas emerge only from collaborative activity with stakeholders. It's a really good point. And finally, we'll have empowered stakeholders. Stakeholders who actually understand that there is an agenda for change and feel that they created the agenda for change and therefore they own it. They are part of the agenda. They're part of the decision-making process. And therefore, beyond that, you've got stakeholder management programs, you've got stakeholders setting and writing agendas, stakeholders managing the consultation on your behalf. They are effectively now your partners. That's what they are. They become your partners in whatever need for change there is. So as an overview of stakeholder management, oh gosh, seen the time. As an overview of stakeholder management, however brief it is, for that, I want to thank you for your time. So I'm going to see if we've got any questions up here now. In a minute. I just got someone making signs at me, but I don't know why. Okay, feel free to ask anything you want. What are you doing, telling me the time? Oh. Timothy Hale. Yeah, thanks. It is a general overview of stakeholder management. So saying thank you for your appreciation. You actually start to look at stakeholders, and really we are only touching the surface. An enormous amount of work to be done on stakeholders, but I'm glad you found that useful. Thanks, Timothy. Anybody else got any comment? Okay. Well, if you think of something later, please let us know and we'll see what we can do. There's an enormous amount of information and data out there on stakeholders that I hold that is available. So you're welcome to ask on the subject of stakeholders, and we'll see if we can get you what you want. So if there is nothing else from anybody, okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you.